So I now turn to the main focus of my talk, which is the development of a liftoff plan, an economic contingency plan for the initial increase in the Fed funds rate. I've described how the FOMC currently sees little tension between its two mandates and how its public communications suggest that this lack of tension between the mandates seems likely to continue. The current and future lack of tension between the two mandates will be a critical foundation for the plan that I'm going to describe. Let me start with some background. The FOMC has two types of accommodation in place right now. First, it is targeting the federal funds rate between 0 and 0.25%. The committee expects to keep that interest rate extraordinarily low at least through mid-2015. Second, the FOMC has bought a large amount of long-term government-issued and government-backed assets. Indeed, in September, the committee announced its intention to expand its holdings of these assets over the coming months. Both of these forms of accommodation are designed to put downward pressure on interest rates. This downward pressure on interest rates is intended to discourage firms and households from saving or buying financial assets. Instead, encourage them to spend. When firms and households spend, their extra demand for goods and services pushes upward on employment and upward on prices. I think it is safe to say that relative to historical norms, the current stance of monetary policy is quite unusual. Now, in June of 2011, the FOMC released a statement describing its exit strategy. That is, the sequence of steps involved in returning monetary policy to a more normal stance. But that 2011 statement said nothing about the conditions that would actually trigger the initiation of this sequence of steps, the exit strategy. And this omission is problematic. The current economic impact of both forms of accommodation, low interest rates and asset purchases, depends on what the public believes about when that accommodation will be removed. So to understand this critical point, consider two possible scenarios. In the first, the public believes that the FOMC will initiate liftoff once the unemployment rate hits 7%. In the second, the public believes the FOMC will initiate liftoff when the unemployment rate hits 6%. The higher unemployment rate in the first scenario means that monetary policy will start to be tightened sooner, which will in turn lead to the unemployment rate staying higher for longer. Foreseeing that, people in this first scenario, when the FOMC is tightening at 7%, people will save more in that first scenario than in the second, so as to protect themselves against the higher risks of being unemployed. Because they save more, they spend less, and there is less economic activity. In other words, the FOMC can provide more current stimulus if people believe that liftoff will be triggered by a lower unemployment rate. So with this observation in mind, the remainder of my remarks will describe what I see as an appropriate liftoff plan. The proposed plan is, as you saw earlier in the introduction, as long as the FOMC is continuing to satisfy its price stability mandate, it should keep the Fed funds rate extraordinarily low until the unemployment rate has fallen below 5.5%. As discussed earlier, by satisfy its price stability mandate, I mean that longer-term inflation expectations are stable, and the committee's outlook is that the annual inflation rate in 2 years will be within 1/4 percentage point of the target inflation rate of 2%. Why is this liftoff plan a desirable one, or appropriate one? Now, I argued earlier that the FOMC can provide more current stimulus by using a lower unemployment threshold for liftoff. Of course, additional monetary stimulus will give rise to more inflationary pressures. And those pressures are problematic because they could lead the FOMC to violate its price stability mandate. But the committee should choose the lowest unemployment threshold that it sees as unlikely to generate a violation of the price stability mandate. Along those lines, most FOMC participants currently project that a long-run unemployment rate less than 6% will be consistent with 2% inflation. Given these projections and given usual estimates of the impact of the unemployment rate on the medium-term inflation outlook, the outlook for the inflation rate is unlikely to be above 2.25% when the unemployment rate is higher than 5.5%. Hence, over the longer run, an unemployment rate threshold of 5.5% is likely to be consistent with price stability. Now, some observers have suggested that by committing to keep the Fed funds rate low until the unemployment rate is as low as 5.5%, the FOMC risks, here I'm trying to paraphrase, getting behind the inflationary curve. As I've discussed, this contingency seems unlikely, given the FOMC's current assessments of the long-run unemployment rate consistent with 2% inflation. In any event, though, this Liftoff Plan provides an escape clause designed specifically to mitigate this risk, because it says as long as the FOMC satisfies its price stability mandate. The plan allows the FOMC to raise the Fed funds rate if long-term inflation expectations deviate too much from historical norms, or if the medium-term outlook for the inflation rate ever exceeds 2.25%. In this fashion, the plan explicitly maintains price stability as an objective, while also promoting a more robust recovery. It is true that the Liftoff Plan doesn't say that the committee will raise the Fed funds rate when the medium-term inflation outlook exceeds 2.25%. It only says that it could. The committee's decision in this context would hinge on a delicate cost-benefit calculation that would weigh inflation increases against employment gains. And in my view, that policy conversation should contemplate a reassessment of the long-run unemployment rate that the committee sees as consistent with 2% inflation. In the same vein, the unemployment rate of 5.5% should be viewed as only a threshold to initiate a policy conversation, not a trigger for action. For example, it's possible that macroeconomic shocks could lead the committee's medium-term outlook for inflation to be below 2% when the unemployment rate falls below 5.5%. At that point, the committee might want to defer initiating exit, and the Liftoff Plan allows the committee to consider doing just that. I should be clear about how this proposed Liftoff Plan generates current stimulus. The basic economics underlying the plan is that if people's expectations about their future prospects improve, they will save less today. As economists are wont to do, I think I could best illustrate this through an extreme example. Suppose that a worker would be given a new contract that contained a no layoff provision. That person would not have to save as much to guard against the possibility of involuntary job loss. That reduced need for saving would translate directly into more spending today. Now, to be clear, was this an example? My proposed Liftoff Plan doesn't promise lifetime protection against layoffs to anybody. What it does promise is the FOMC will fully support much higher levels of economic activity. Thus, the plan commits to keeping the Fed funds rate extraordinarily low until the unemployment rate is much nearer historical norms, as long as inflation does remain under control. With that commitment, households can anticipate that unemployment will fall more rapidly, meaning more job security and more jobs available for those who are looking. With that brighter future in store, households will save less and spend more today, and that will drive up economic activity. Now, this plan is distinct from proposals that recommend that the FOMC attempt to stimulate the economy by generating inflation that is well above target. The idea of those proposals is that faced with higher inflation, people will spend more today to avoid the higher future prices. As I've just described, the Liftoff Plan in this speech does not operate in that way. Instead, my plan contains price stability as a cornerstone, while still promoting a faster recovery. And I'm highly skeptical about the inflation-based approach given current economic conditions. The FOMC has said that it views the current unemployment rate as being elevated relative to the levels that it sees as being consistent with its mandate to promote maximum employment. With such high unemployment, labor is not scarce. Wage pressures are muted. And that will translate directly into the medium-term outlook for inflation being consistent with price stability. So this reasoning argues that it's difficult for the FOMC to foster above-target inflation given current circumstances, given how high the unemployment rate is. Now, this reasoning was based on an implicit presumption that longer-term inflation expectations remain stable. The FOMC could potentially generate significantly higher inflation in the nearer term by using words and deeds to shift longer-term inflation expectations upward. I would see any such action as being inconsistent with the FOMC's January 2012 statement of longer-run goals that I mentioned earlier.